All right. Thank you everyone for coming today to our Lunch and Learn, which is sponsored by ADAI, CATS, and the greatest holiday of the year, Halloween. And you'll see what I mean by that very soon. Before I launch, I just want to let you know that we're going to cover a lot today, but we also created a webpage for you that has a very comprehensive list of resources touching on everything we're going to go over, plus some things we won't have time to get to. You can find that at adai.uw.edu/accessibility. So check that out when you have questions down the line. Okay, before I get started, just want to introduce myself and my amazing colleague, Erin McGraw. So my name is Meg Bruner, and I am a librarian here at ADAI. I specialize in information retrieval, management, and dissemination, and I've been pretty heavily engaged in digital accessibility work for over a decade. Erin McGraw works with me, and together we make up ADAI's information team. Erin specializes in graphic design, instructional design, and photography and videography, and she's going to be talking to you in just a little bit about accessible design, data, and language. All right, so let's dive in. First, what is accessibility? When we think about disability accessibility, we often think of physical spaces like ramps for wheelchairs, automatic door openers, maybe braille on ATM machines, or those crosswalk lights that talk and tell you when it's safe to go. All of those things are examples of accessibility technologies, and they are used to provide people with different kinds of disabilities equitable access to the world around them. That means they get the same information, interactions, and services as everybody else, all equally effective and equally integrated with equivalent ease of use. The same is true for digital spaces. People with vision, hearing, mobility, or cognitive disabilities also deserve to have equitable access to the internet too. And for that, what we're mostly focusing on is making sure that everybody can access the same information fully, equally, and independently. And unlike some of those complex physical accessibility examples, digital accessibility is something we can all contribute to because many of the skills and tools that we need for that are things that we're already using every day in our work. Can I build a wheelchair ramp? No, I cannot. Can I make my PDF report accessible to everyone? I sure can. The next thing to keep in mind as we talk is that when we're talking about digital accessibility, we're mostly thinking about four types of disabilities. Hearing disabilities, including hard of hearing people and deaf folks who often rely on things like captions and transcripts for podcasts and videos, for example. Disabilities related to vision, including blindness, low vision, and color vision deficiencies, many of whom rely on screen reader software, which is software that reads content on screen out loud to them. Mobility-related disabilities, especially those that impact somebody's ability to use tools like a computer mouse. A lot of people with mobility disabilities rely on being able to navigate content using just a keyboard, for example. And people with cognitive disabilities or neurodiversity who might use tools like browser plugins that can help make on-screen content less distracting or easier to read. And again, the goal here is to make sure all these different people can obtain the same information as fully, equally, and independently as someone who is not disabled. All right, classic distracted boyfriend meme here. I threw this together to illustrate a really important point. I think a lot of times people perceive accessibility stuff as a set of extra steps you have to take that will only make a difference to a small percentage of users. Do I really have to spend all this time writing alt text for every image in my slides or editing these closed captions? Like, how many deaf people are really going to watch my webinar, right? This is the wrong way to think about accessibility, though, because every single thing we're going to talk about today improves the quality of your work for all users, not just for disabled users. Just thinking about captions alone, I use captions on my home TV for everything I watch, and I am not hard of hearing. I also use screen readers sometimes when I'm working on something and I want my phone to read me the instructions while I stay focused on the task. Accessible design and language, Erin's going to show you how that makes information easier for everyone to understand. So accessibility is not just about improving your work for disabled people. It's about improving your work, period. But in addition to simply being the right thing to do for yourself and everybody else, making your content accessible is also required. There have long been a number of federal and state policies that required content at the UW to be accessible, and you've probably heard terms before like 508 compliant or ADA compliant, both of which refer to various of those policies. But in the past, there were enough exceptions to the rules that it made it easy for folks to kind of skate on by them. That all changed in April 2024, though, when the DOJ updated the rules under Title II of the ADA, which now requires institutions like the University of Washington to ensure that all UW-affiliated websites and everything posted on those websites developed by UW folks meet what's called WCAG 2.1 Level AA Accessibility Standards by April 24th, 2026. Now, what is WCAG Level AA? WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is a set of internationally recognized guidelines for digital accessibility developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is also called W3C. Now, pause here for a quick second to talk about the pronunciation of WCAG. There is no one right way. How you pronounce it basically depends on where you fall on a D&D alignment chart. Like I say WCAG because I'm neutral good. Some people say WCAG, which is obviously chaotic good. Some people say WCAG, which is chaotic neutral. And then there are other people who say each letter separately, WCAG, clearly chaotic evil. Anyway, if you don't understand a single thing I just said, congratulations. You're obviously much cooler than I was in high school. Okay, back to our slide though. Anyway, these guidelines are built on 4 principles, the POUR principles. So okay, back to the slide. Anyway, these guidelines are built on 4 principles. They're called the POUR principles. So that is P, all content must be perceivable, which means everyone should be able to access it in some useful way. Operable, meaning it has to be navigable and work through different input methods like keyboards and mice. Understandable, pretty straightforward. And robust, which mostly refers to clean, well-structured code that works with all the various technologies. And then the guidelines are divided into 3 conformance levels. There's single A, which is the bare minimum and primarily means your content will work well with tools like screen readers and keyboards instead of mice. Then there's double A, which is the mid-range level and the one that is now required. That includes all the level A guidelines, plus things like a color contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, which Erin will talk about, an accessible content structure, and consistent navigation. And then finally, there's AAA, the highest level, which adds a higher contrast ratio, sign language translation, and audio descriptions for videos, which are separate audio files that describe what's happening visually on screen. Those are different from captions. So basically that double A level is, for our purposes, now the bare minimum. And level AAA is what we would want to strive to whenever possible, but we're not required to implement that. So what kinds of content does this apply to? First, it applies to what we'll be covering today, which is electronic documents, including word processing files, presentation slides and PDFs, video and audio files, social media, and graphics and data visualizations. It also applies to websites overall and mobile apps, which we don't have time to get into today, as well as any content posted on our websites that we created but that is hosted on a third-party platform, like a MailChimp newsletter we share a link to, or our videos or podcasts hosted elsewhere. There are still a few exceptions to the new rules, though, and they include things like archived web content, which refers to content created before the April 2026 deadline that is kept for reference, research, or record keeping only, and is kept in a separate area on the website for archived content. Another exception is content created by a third party and shared on our website unless we contracted with that third party to develop that content. So this might be sharing a document or a video that was created by another organization without our involvement, but that we want to make available to our users. We don't have to try to make someone else's stuff accessible, essentially. And then it also doesn't apply to social media posts before April 2026 or password protected documents that are only made available to a small number of users, though I would, and I will, argue that you should make those accessible anyway. All this said about requirements, though, The main point I want to make today is that creating accessible documents in particular is very easy, and it's something all of you are capable of doing, in part because the tools we often use to create documents like Word or PowerPoint make it simple. And again, accessibility helps all users. So be an accessible superhero like this adorable cat and start getting in the habit of thinking of accessibility from the beginning of your project instead of thinking of it as a set of extra steps you have to take at the end. Okay, so now I'm going to hop out of my slides and take us into a Word document so I can show you the difference between accessible and inaccessible documents and also show you the tools built right in Word. So let me switch over. We'll find this. So you should now be seeing a Word document. Those of us who can see that document can understand right away what it is, right? It's a document called Monster Movies that has two sections, each with a header followed by a list. It also has an image off to the side and a link down at the bottom. And for the record, yes, there really is a movie called Chupacabra versus the Alamo, and it stars 80s heartthrob Eric Estrada from Chips. Check it out. But anyway, this document might look accessible. Certainly we can tell what's going on there, right? But it's actually not. And I was going to play a little demo of what a screen reader would sound like when it reads this, but we just don't really have time today. So instead, let me just scroll down for a second. What I've done here is recreate exactly what a screen reader is going to read this content as. And what it's going to do is this. You can see here that because the structure of our document up above was conveyed only using font sizes and colors and line breaks and other formatting things like that, a screen reader, which cannot tell structure based on visual elements, just assumes all the text is basically a single sentence, and it runs all the words together. And we are told there was an image. You can see the word image right here. But it's not described to us. We have no idea what the image was of. And there was not only no way to tell that there were two lists being presented here, there's also no way to tell what the individual movie titles were. Was that two movies, Chupacabra versus the Alamo and Dino Gator, or was that one incredibly awesome movie, Chupacabra versus the Alamo Dino Gator? Alas, it was the former, maybe someday. And also look at how it addresses that link. Oh gosh, torture. It's going to read every character out loud one at a time. HTTPS semicolon slash slash www dot, etc. In addition to being useless in this way, it also removes the user's ability to navigate the document. An accessible document tags all the structural elements so a screen reader can tell what the headers and links are. And the user can actually have the screen reader just read them a list of all the headers so that they can, just like we sighted folks can, quickly jump ahead to just the section they're interested in. Same thing with links. You can have the screen reader narrate all the links on a page to you. But think about being read just a list of URLs. Would you be able to tell what any of those documents or websites were just by hearing the URLs read out? No. So how can we fix this document? Well, the good news here is that Word makes it pretty simple to create accessible files. So thinking again about what we saw the screen reader do, all the words here strung all together, basically what we need is a way to let the screen reader know the types of content we're creating here and what the structure of our document is. In order to do that, we can rely on Word's own tools. And the number one tool you want to become familiar with in Word is this section up here labeled Styles. You can use this section to label content in the document as the title or the subtitle. Here, I'll open it so you can see title, subtitle, heading, subheading, quotes. There's all kinds of different formatting options here. You can also create your own style if you have something unique that you want to add to a document. It's very easy to use. Now, there are two approaches to setting styles up. One is if you know exactly what formatting you want to use for your major styles before you begin, which is especially handy if you're setting up a template for others to use. You can just hover over the relevant style, like title here, right-click on it to see some options, select Modify, and a box will open that will let you set the font type, the size, the weight, bold, italic, whatever, the color. You can also use this format thing at the bottom. So now you can set line spacing or padding, borders, whatever you want to do. Basically make it look however you want and store it as a style. The other way, which is the way I am more likely to use, is to design your style right in the document so you can see what it looks like. And then you can just highlight a particular style, like I'll highlight the title here. Then you go up and right click on title again. And this time you're going to select update title to match selection. And now you can see right in the style box here that it's changed the formatting in this box area up here to match the title formatting that I had in the document. So you can see that it's done, right? Let's do the same thing with our header. I'm going to move this graphic because sometimes it messes things up. Select the header, go up to heading, right click, update to match selection. You can see it changed here. And now what you can do is actually just go through and highlight all your headers, click that button, and now they've all been tagged appropriately. The nice thing is you can also add a new one, like let's just put future monster movies in here. And to make it format the same, I just have to select it and then click heading. And you can see now it's not only tagged it as a heading, but it made it visually match the styles of all my other headings. So that's a really great feature. The other nice thing about this is that if later you decide you want to change how all your headers look, you can just go back to the style, right click again, select modify, and now you can change the formatting. So maybe I want to make them orange instead of red. I can just do that here, click OK, and now you can see it carried it through the entire document. I don't have to do them one at a time to make them match. So yeah, this is for accessibility, but see how it just made your life a lot easier too. Um, the next thing we want to do for this document is make sure the lists are actually lists. That's very important. This graphic's giving me a hassle. So we're going to do that. We just use the built-in list function, which we're all familiar with using. There's that. And then we also want to change this link at the bottom so that it's not the URL, which again is going to be both annoying to listen to in the screen reader and also confusing. For a digital document, we'll want to use meaningful link text instead, text that actually describes where the link is taking you. So I'm just going to make the text here the link like this. And now when the screen reader reads all of the links on my page, they're going to be useful to the person who's listening. They'll know exactly what those links are for, and they can jump right to something that is interesting to them. Finally, let's take a look at this image, which the screen reader told us was here but didn't describe. We have two options for alt text, and you get to both of them by right-clicking and then selecting View Alt Text. The first option is to actually describe the image, and I'll talk about the best approach to writing alt text in a few minutes. But in the case of a graphic like this, where it's really just there for visual interest and it isn't conveying any information that isn't already in the text, here it's just repeating the title, for example. The better move is just to mark it as decorative so the screen reader ignores it completely. We don't need to waste the screen reader user's time with that one. Okay, we're pretty sure we have an accessible document here now, but let's double check. Word has an accessibility checker tool that can review our document for us and let us know if we missed anything. You find that by going to review and then check accessibility, and it'll open up over here on the right. And as you can see, looks good, no issues found. We solved it. If there had been any problems, if we missed anything, it would tell us, and that would include things like alt text, color contrast issues, if we had a table that wasn't set up properly, if we had structural issues like missing headers or titles. The tool would not only tell us what specifically we missed, but it will also help us fix the problem too. Now, when a screen reader reads this, it's going to announce each type of content. It's going to say document title, monster movies, heading level 1, bad monster movies, bullet, Chupacabra versus the Alamo, bullet, Dino Gator, bullet, Lavalonchilla, etc. It's much more understandable and usable for the user. Okay, so that's Word. Not too bad, right? So let's go back to my slides in PowerPoint. And we'll stay here in designer mode so we can take a look at accessibility here as well. When it comes to slides, you do not have to make slides accessible if you're just presenting with them and not also sharing them later. Also, if you're going to email them out to a small group of attendees rather than posting them on a website for everyone to view, you can technically skip these steps as well, though again, I'm going to argue that you shouldn't, but you can. For slides you want to share on the web, though, either as a PowerPoint file or as a PDF, you do have to do this, and it is very similar to working in Word, so it's pretty easy. When I go to make a slide deck accessible, I always start with the accessibility checker, which again is under review, check accessibility, check accessibility. It's going to open over here on the right. I also always hit this toggle because I like to go one slide at a time, so do that. And now you can see exactly what this slide needs me to adjust. First, it's missing alt text for my big image there. And second, none of the text content has been labeled as the slide title. So all you have to do to fix this is click on each thing, missing alt text. Now I could describe this image, but it's really just there for visual interest and to be adorable. So I'm just going to mark it as decorative, get it out of the way. And then for missing slide title, it's actually going to select the box when I click it that it thinks is probably the title. And you can see over here, this box has been selected. And then you can just click set a slide title and approve. And now we're done. We don't see any other issues on this slide. Now on this next slide, we see the same things over here as before, missing alt text, missing slide title, but we're also seeing a new issue. This is telling me, this check reading order is telling me it wants me to make sure a screen reader is going to read each element on this slide in the right order because it's not a very linearly designed slide. So let's take a look at this. So I can see here from this list that it's not actually in the order that I would want. First, it's the title, which is great, but then it's listing both pictures and then both text boxes. And I would want to describe my picture and then read my text box, then Erin's picture and then her text box. So what I can do is I can just click on the items here and move them up or down until they're in the right place. So I'm going to move my text box up, and now it's title, my picture, and you can see as I click on objects, it highlights them so you know exactly what you're talking about. My picture, my text box, Erin's picture, Erin's text box. Now, sometimes reading order changes can cause some issues with your actual slide. That's because objects on a slide are placed there in layers. Each object is an individual layer, and the first object is on the bottom layer. So for example, on this slide, if we look at the reading order, you can see it wants to describe the image first, and then it wants to do the title and then the content. I might want it to do the title first, but the problem here is my image is covering the full slide. So if I move the title above it, the title gets put on the first layer, which is on the bottom. And now it's invisible on the slide because the picture on the next layer covers it up. So let's put it back. In the case of this slide, I would either just leave things in the original order, it's not a big deal, or as with this specific slide, I would just mark this image as decorative because again, it's not really a meaningful graphic. So essentially you do this for every slide in the deck and then boom, you would have accessible slides. You can do this, you can also do this as you create the slides. For example, when you add an image to the slide, you can add alt text right then instead of waiting until the end. And you can also go back and turn off that toggle that shows you one slide at a time, and it'll show you all the issues in the full deck. And that's kind of nice sometimes because you can fix them in batches. So like if I click missing alt text now, it's going to show me the first slide that needs that. I click this arrow, it's going to go to the next image that needs it, the next image that needs it, the next one, so on and so forth. And I can just take care of them all at the same time. Some people prefer to do that. And that's PowerPoint, man, it's pretty easy, right? Okay, so let me go back to sharing my slides. All right, so to recap, for Word documents, you want to use those styles and other built-in styling tools like lists. That's probably the single most important thing for accessibility in Word. You want to think about the structural elements in your document. Keep tables simple, which we didn't have time to talk about today. Use alt text for graphics, use meaningful link text, and run that accessibility checker at the end. For PowerPoint, it's the same kind of stuff. Use the accessibility checker and go slide by slide or fix issues in batches. Don't forget about that alt text and be sure to check the reading order on every slide, being really careful about that layers issue. A few quick words here on writing good alt text. This is kind of an art, and not everybody agrees on a single best approach to doing it well, but essentially you want to keep alt text as simple and straightforward as possible, keeping in mind that someone has to listen to a screen reader read all of that to them. If the image is really just there for visual interest and isn't conveying important information, mark it as decorative so the screen reader ignores it completely. And when you're thinking about what you need to write, think to yourself, what does someone who can't see this image need to know about it? Sometimes that's going to be different depending on the actual context of where the image is. So it's not the case that one image always has the same alt text no matter what it's being used for. It really depends on the purpose in that specific setting. A lot of times, especially on social media platforms where you can click a tag now to read someone's alt text, people will use that space to do things like add some jokes or throw in some keywords for the search engine. Do not ever do this. Alt text is not for secret messages or lots of extra humor, as much as that might be fun. It is explicitly to ensure that people who can't see your image get the same exact information as people who can, not more information, the same information. Next, let's talk about Adobe PDFs. So first, let me begin by saying I hate Adobe PDFs with the fiery passion of 10,000 suns. They're basically impossible to read on a phone, and an inaccessible PDF can be extremely difficult to remediate or make accessible. That skill set alone requires hours of education and practice to do well, so I'm not even going to try to walk you through any of that today. The good news for accessibility, though, is that PDFs usually start off as something else. And if that something else, like a Word document, is accessible, when you save it as a PDF, the resultant PDF document will be like 95% accessible too. And I can get you to that last 5% pretty easily before we post it on our websites. In my opinion, PDFs are best avoided whenever possible. I only use them if there's a need to have a printable version of something and for archiving and preservation purposes. Like, I want a PDF of your journal articles and reports because I want to put them in my library database and preserve them as a single document created at a specific time. For everything else, PDF is not your friend. For example, the ubiquitous PDF flyer for an event attached to an email. This is very unnecessary, it's probably not accessible, and plus, very few people will bother to open that attachment. So why do all that extra work, right? Instead, put all the information from that flyer into the body of your email. It's much more usable for everybody that way. For other types of documents you want to share online, especially for things that will be periodically updated, consider having a web page version for online viewing and only offering a PDF if there's a need for a printable version, or again, for archiving. It's much easier to make a web page accessible than a PDF. It's also easier to update a web page than a PDF. And for ADAI folks, I'm always happy to help you with that. Before we move on, I also wanted to call out a practice I've been seeing a lot more of lately, and that is this weird trend of creating an enormous image file to replace what would previously probably have been a PDF. You can see an example here. This is basically an event flyer that is just one big JPEG. This is the worst possible approach you could take for sharing information. There is pretty much no way to make this accessible. You'd have to transcribe all the content by hand, typing it all out, and put it in the alt text field. And not only would that just suck for a screen reader user to listen to, but it would also have no structural elements at all because there's no structural elements in alt text. It would read just like our inaccessible monster movie list with everything all crammed together. I also can't use this to promote your event on our social media because I can't create usable alt text for it and because it would be hard to read. And it's hard for me to add it to an event calendar or to blog it because I have to retype everything myself. Just do not do this. If you do, this cat will judge you and you do not want that. Look at this. Look at this guy's face. All right, we are almost done with my section. So up next, just a few words about videos and podcasts. Here at ADAI, the info team takes care of all this for everybody, so ADAI folks don't need to worry about it. For others, just be aware that in order to make videos and podcasts comply with the rules, they have to have accurate captions and transcripts. One thing to be aware of when you're doing that work is that while platforms like Zoom and YouTube will generate automatic transcripts and or captions for you, the results will not be accessible. They'll be loaded with tons of errors. In order to comply with the regulations, you have to go in and edit that output to make sure it matches the actual audio accurately. Our resource list has some information on various tools and approaches you can use for captioning and transcripts, so check that out if you need help with videos and podcasts. Also, just as a quick aside here, when you're hosting a live online event, you may get a request for a disability accommodation like ASL interpreters or live captioning. These kinds of services can be booked through the UW Disability Office, and if you're at ADAI, I can help you with the whole process, including discussing the options if you don't have the funding to pay for those services. They can cost anywhere from like $80 to $160 an hour. So just reach out to me if you get a request and we'll work through it together. All right, last, just a few words here about social media. Basically, for social media, you want to make sure you're including alt text for any images you share. Every major platform makes that possible now, so no excuses. You also want to avoid using a lot of emoji. Screen readers will read out each emoji one at a time, and it can be really annoying if there's a ton of them. Sometimes on social media, you also see folks sharing memes that use ASCII characters. It's called ASCII art, like you see in the graphic there. This is incredibly bad practice too, even though it's fun. I understand. If you look at that example though, and you think about what a screen reader is going to do with that, you can figure out why. It has to read every character. So it's going to say plus sign, dash, 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 etc. One line at a time. Ugh, torture. So instead of replicating that in your post, like you copying and pasting it right into the post, make it in something like Word and then take a screenshot and post that with some alt text instead. Finally, and this is not just for hashtags, but also for URLs that you share on graphics or documents, always use what's called camel case or Pascal case for formatting those. Camel case is a lowercase letter for the first word, then each additional word starts with a capital letter. Pascal uses uppercase first letters for all the words, as you can see in the examples there. If you use all lowercase and your terms have multiple words crammed together, a screen reader is going to assume that's a single word and it will struggle to read it correctly. But also, so will people who can see it, because it's sometimes really hard to figure out where the words break, and this can occasionally lead to hilarious disaster. For example, the hashtag that launched singer Susan Boyle's first album, which many people on social media both unintentionally and intentionally misread as Sue's anal bum party instead of Susan album party. So that was fun. And then URLs can also have similar problems like this one, which looks like expert sex change, but is actually experts exchange. Very different. There have been so many examples of hashtag fails that go viral. You do not want your hashtag fail to go viral. So camel case or Pascal case, please. And all right, that is it for me. Let's hand this over to Erin.
All right, so let's dig even deeper into using design to create materials with accessibility in mind. As Meg was mentioning earlier, there are multiple kinds of accessibility to consider, and it's certainly not a fringe issue. If you design your materials accessibly, it really does help everyone, and it's important to making sure that your information is reaching any and all audiences. So we'll start by going over a little bit of learning theory, specifically cognitive load theory, which is how the brain takes in, processes, and stores information. Learning requires a lot of cognitive processing. Taking in new information uses a part of your memory that's limited. This is called working memory. When you try to input too much information or in an ineffective way, it's really easy to cause something called cognitive overload, and this is where the learning pretty much stops altogether. I'll be going over some examples of what this looks like and how you can prevent it. And this is true really for every learner, but it's especially important in the context of accessibility. Some people have cognitive or learning disabilities, and it's important to make sure that they're included in your audience. But this isn't just extra work. Avoiding cognitive overload improves the learning and retention for everyone. Next, I'm going to go over some design principles that will help you avoid cognitive overload when you're building all different kinds of materials. Some of these concepts might be familiar to those who have seen my design talks before, but let's think about them specifically with accessibility in mind. So the first element of design that you'll want to consider is space. Space is how the objects in your visual relate to each other. And objects, as Meg was saying earlier, are really any individual item like text boxes, images, shapes, charts, or anything else that you have that's part of the whole. On this slide, these are all the objects that make up the whole slide. And the space in between these objects is called padding. And it's important to keep your padding in mind. You want to let your objects have breathing room so they're easier to take in. There's sort of a visual flow to how a person takes in information, and when you avoid overcrowding your different objects, it will help their eye move across and process that information easier. When we're talking about using space effectively, there are a couple of ways that you can do this and avoid cognitive overload. In presentations, that means only visually showing the most essential information. You want your audience to quickly be able to understand the most important parts without adding to their cognitive load. This means not using full sentences on screen. That's what your verbal component is for. And in terms of accessibility, that's why something like closed captioning can be so important. You also need to make sure that you have a hierarchy of information where the title gives context first, the headings in the middle give the most important information second, and the body, the smallest, gives the details last. These can be distinguished from each other primarily by size, but also by color and things like bolding. In terms of sizing, it's really important that both your objects and your text are large enough to be able to be easily seen and read. It takes a lot more effort and concentration to read teeny tiny text, like on the bottom of this screen, and it ends up distracting your audience from being able to listen and learn. It can also mean the difference between someone with impaired vision being able to receive your information at all or not. And as a general rule, the minimum size for something like a PowerPoint should be 28 points, and that's really reserved for the body text. You'll need to go larger for things like headers and titles. And for other documents like reports, 12 point is a pretty standard minimum. There's definitely a balance to be struck between your text and the graphics that you're using to support it. Neither should be so tiny that someone has to struggle to understand or see it, or so big that it leaves no space for the other. And in the spirit of letting your objects breathe, you should avoid overlapping them unless it's intentional, like a full page image with text or a call-out box that's overlaid on top. So next, we'll look at some examples of what not to do and then what to do that use these principles. So here's the first example of what not to do. It's a complete overload of information. All of the text on this screen is way too small to read easily, and your audience isn't going to even be able to read it all in the time that this slide is up on the screen. The problem here is instead of supporting your information, it serves as a distraction from what you're saying. And anyone really, but especially someone with difficulties processing text, will be completely excluded from understanding your point. There's also pretty much no space for a supporting graphic, so we run into issues with overlapping, and you can see here that the text that's overlapping on top of the image is barely legible. The image here is also way too small to do its job. It ends up kind of looking like an afterthought instead of an intentional supportive element. And here's an example where the most important and relevant information has been pulled out and organized into a hierarchy. We have a clear difference between the title, the headers, and the body. The full sentences have been broken down into only those most important and digestible phrases, and there's enough space, plenty really, to include a supportive image. When you use an image like this, your audience will know at first glance what you're going to talk about, which primes their brain for better understanding. So, with those two examples in mind, here are some tips that will help you use your space better. First, make a handout or even a web page if you want your audience to get more information or context than what you're presenting. Don't just stick it in your slides hoping that they'll read it later. Make a simple handout or web page so they can get more information and read it at their own pace. And in that vein, don't use full sentences as a visual. Use your verbal component to elaborate the details and streamline your visual component into only the most important phrases. And last, you want to avoid overcrowding in small text by breaking up the information and organizing it. This often means using something like multiple slides or pages to distribute the information across. If you really need to include all 20 reasons why Halloween is awesome, which I don't blame you for, you'll pretty much always do better by spreading the information out rather than trying to jam it all into one spot. In a slide deck, you can keep the headers at the top the same so people have the same context for the information that you're giving them. All right, so the next design element to consider is color. Color can be really essential for making your visual stand out, and it also focuses people's attention across that visual flow and hierarchy of information. An example of this is using color in your headers to distinguish them better from your body text. And you can see here on this slide that my headers are purple and bold and larger than the body text, which is simple and black. It's also important to avoid extremes that distract and cause that cognitive overload. Here's a couple of quick examples I'm going to show you of these two extremes. So this one, as you can see, uses no color at all, and it isn't particularly engaging. The text ends up feeling a little bit overwhelming because it has little flow and no visual support. And on the opposite end, this is a huge visual overload, and it really distracts from your ability to learn about monsters, which again is really important. In this sense, it's really about finding a balance between your content and what it exists on. So if you have a simple design, like a slide with a white background, you should focus on using more color in your content. And vice versa, if you have a colorful design, like a slide with a color gradient or an image for a background, make your content simpler so it doesn't compete with it. In terms of accessibility, you need to make sure that the colors you use in your background and your foreground have high contrast, like dark text on a white background or white text on a dark background. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that now. High contrast is really important for readability, but also for reducing cognitive load and making sure that people with impaired vision can access your information. To make sure materials are as readable as possible, we rely on something called contrast ratio. And contrast ratio is the difference in shade between your foreground, which is usually something like text, and your background, which is usually a plain color. A high contrast between these two means that your presentation will be easier to see and read. And the best practice is to use a plain white background and to make your font and content dark. You can always add images and other interesting elements to make it visually engaging. For accessibility purposes, contrast ratios between specific colors are given a number, which needs to be above a certain threshold to be compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. There are some really good free online tools, like one of my favorites is accessible-colors.com, where you can input two colors and have it check them automatically for you. So it does really make it easy. Some other factors to the WCAG score are weight, like if something is regular or bold, and font size. And here's an example of what low contrast and high contrast can look like. The low contrast on the left is much harder to read, and that's especially true for someone with impaired vision. In either case, it increases the cognitive load on the viewer, but more importantly, it can mean the difference between being able to access your information or not at all. And the same is true when we use light text. It's important to use the high contrast counterpart to your background and foreground accordingly. So again, if you have a dark background, use this white text. If you have a light background, use black text, just as some examples. And as I had just mentioned earlier, one tool that I really like for automating this is accessible-colors.com, where you can check the contrast ratio between your text and background colors. And this site does use the WCAG guidelines, and it gives you a pass or a fail. And here you can see that you input your text color as a hexadecimal code and also the size and weight of your font. And then you add your background color to the code as well and the type of compliance that you're going for. And UW's new rules coming in the spring are going to require at least AA compliance, as Meg mentioned earlier, but you can also shoot for AAA compliance. The checker will then tell you if you pass or fail, and it gives you a specific ratio number. And the great thing about this specific online tool that I really love is that it also tells you how to become compliant by giving you examples like if you changed your background to this, it would pass, or if you changed your text to this, it would pass. So it really does the work for you. All right, so next I'm going to touch very briefly on typography, or rather the fonts that you choose for your materials. The most important thing to consider is readability. You want to choose a font that's clear and easy to read, unlike some of the examples I have here. A good rule of thumb is that it's okay to only use one font throughout your design, but you should really limit yourself to just two if you want a different font for your title. The body should always stay the same font. And this really does help reduce the cognitive load of your audience. As you can see in this example here, it's a bit distracting to look at all the different types of fonts instead of paying attention to the important information. So here's a few quick tips. First, you can bold particular words in your phrase, and that makes the most important information clearer as someone scans the graphic. And another really important one is that when you add new objects to a document or a presentation, like a text box or chart, often it defaults to a different font than what you might be using elsewhere. Usually in Microsoft products, the culprit is Calibri. You see that almost every time you insert something new, it'll default to Calibri. So make sure that you change it in that new object back to the font that you're using everywhere else. And lastly, in our digital world, the best practice is generally to use sans serif fonts, which are the ones that don't have the little tags on the corners like Times New Roman does. And that's because serif fonts like Times New Roman are generally reserved for print, like newspapers. And even now, many print materials use sans serif anyway because it will inevitably exist online, so the default is to use that sans serif, no tags. All right, so the last design element I'm going to cover is consistency, and this is an important one, especially for having an accessible presentation or any other type of material. If you have inconsistent design elements, they can be really distracting and add to that cognitive load unnecessarily. So here is a little list of things to keep in mind when you're checking that everything you've put together is consistent. First, that your font style is the same throughout. Like I was saying earlier, make sure you take extra care when you're adding in a new object like a text box or chart because they often default to another font. Make sure that you're paying attention to your grammar and punctuation, especially things like capitalization and using periods or not. This is especially true in things like lists, whether you have periods or you don't. It can be fine either way, but just make sure that it's the same throughout. And you'll also want to pay attention to how you've placed your objects. For example, that all the titles are in the same relative place and not jittering around from side to side. Your alignment and spacing, like bullets staying the same distance from the side as each other and the space between your lines. And last, your colors, that each type of object, like titles or headers, are using the same color throughout. This subconsciously signals to a viewer what type of object it is and reduces their cognitive load. Another important consideration when you're building your materials is including images. They're not just extra or to make things pretty, they do a lot of work. Images can help support your information by giving people a quick understanding about what you're talking about. And research shows that they help people retain and care about information more than text alone. They also account for different learning styles for folks with text processing difficulties, cognitive disabilities, or even just visual learners. The format of your presentation is another important consideration. Is it going to be viewed on a large projector, on a computer screen, or on a small mobile screen? A good rule of thumb is that the larger the screen, the more wiggle room there is to include more content as it still can easily be seen. But presentations that are on a computer monitor or especially being seen on a mobile screen really do need to be simplified and not overcrowded with content. If you can't pare it down, remember that tip to spread the information across multiple slides or pages and keep the titles and headers so your viewers still have that context. Most importantly, just remember to think about the smallest common denominator. If you think your materials will be viewed on mobile at all, you really need to build them according to that level. So now that we've covered visual accessibility, let's talk about the language that you use in your materials. This is really important for reaching diverse and wide audiences from all walks of life, and it makes a really big difference in how someone engages with your materials. One of the most important questions you can ask yourself before putting together a presentation or any other type of material where you're writing is, who is my audience? This question should change how you approach things like reading level and wording, and can also influence what types of images you use to support your information. If your material is being shared publicly in any way, like being posted online afterwards, it's important to build it accordingly. The reading level should be at a high school level maximum, but ideally more like 8th grade, and you should make an effort to simplify any overly complicated charts or graphs. For non-public audiences, you can tailor your content to fit their specific background. So this could mean things like having more leeway for academic jargon with an audience that's only going to be made up of researchers, or having the ability to add some more humor if you're in a casual colleague setting. If your material is going to be shared in any public capacity, like being posted online, you should really consider reframing how you think about the language before you start putting it together. So ask yourself, how would you explain this to your teenage niece or even to someone on the street? You want to take that conversational approach and apply it to how you build and write your materials. Here are some really common examples. So, utilize and persons might be appropriate for an academic journal, but you wouldn't utilize them in everyday conversation when you're talking to different persons, if you see what I mean. A great resource for checking the reading level of your text is something called the Hemingway app, and it's a free online tool that gives your content a readability score by grade level. And it also highlights specific problem areas with a color-coded system that suggests what you might need to change to get it to a lower reading level. And finally, we're going to take some of these principles and apply them to data visualization. Things like contrast ratio, font size, and alt text can apply really broadly across materials and mediums, and that includes data. And I'm going to give you some tips on making sure that your charts or graphs or other data-related visuals are made with accessibility in mind. First, you want to title your data visual with something meaningful to what the data is showing. You'll want to keep it short and use simple language, and make sure to include the main point. You also want to clearly label your data so it's obvious what each bar or line is referring to. And importantly, try to label each data point instead of relying on a legend. You also want to differentiate your data sections. Certain types of color visual impairment will make somebody see your colors differently, or they might not be able to distinguish them at all from each other. And this can be fixed in a few ways. You can use a high contrast ratio between each data section, like having a dark, a medium, and a light color. You can use textures besides solid color. And you can even add white space between the sections so each is distinguishable as its own shape. And you can do that by clicking on the section and adding an outline to it. The graph here is an example that uses all of these methods for accessibility. And let's look at what happens when you don't use any of those measures. It might look fine at first to some people, but for someone with impaired color vision, the data becomes totally lost. This is the exact same chart, just with a black and white filter. And back to our first example, you can see here how the high contrast between the sections, the white space between them, and the varied patterns all work to differentiate the data. And as Meg mentioned earlier, alt text is a really important accessibility measure, and that also includes using it with charts and graphs. You'll want to have one or two sentences that describe the data, including the chart type. And another important tip is if the data is described in the text next to it, you can just put something like refer to text for description as your alt text to avoid redundancy so that screen reader doesn't read the exact same thing twice. The description will depend on what information your audience will find most relevant or important. You don't have to include each data point necessarily. Sometimes you can describe just the most important data or an overall trend in the data in plain language. One example of this for our chart here is a proportional bar chart ranking Halloween costumes by popularity. Witch is the highest spooky costume, superhero is the highest fun costume. And this is especially important if there's a lot of data points or they're really complex. Sometimes it's better just to refer to the description and the text in that case too. If you can still fit the description in one or two short sentences, you can also include the discrete data points like in this example. It really just depends on the data that you have and what your audience needs out of that information. So thank you so much for watching today. If you have any questions or you need any help with accessibility, please feel free to reach out to Meg and I. We're always happy to answer questions and help when you need it. So feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.